Well, hello, and how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having
Good.
me.
Welcome to Toronto Life's first The City Live. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all the participants that have logged on. It's really great to have a nice group with us tonight. Um, for those of you who are just joining us, I'm here with Ariel Lefkowitz, who is the author of this month's Toronto Life cover story. The manuscript came to us over the transom, as they say, so unsolicited. It arrived in our submissions mailbox from a person we had no relationship with at the magazine. And it stopped us in our tracks. It was the account of 2 weeks in mid to late March at Sunnybrook Hospital. It was written in a diary format, describing in very personal and vivid detail the experiences of Dr. Lefkowitz in setting up a COVID ward, Sunnybrook's first COVID ward. And to my mind, it's the best unsolicited manuscript Toronto Life has ever received. Truth be told, we don't get a lot of them, and this was a totally mesmerizing read. It was extremely topical, extremely urgent, and revealed the initial chaos and confusion, coupled with an emotional response, a very human response, and also the evolving science that was happening at the time. We've never met before, never had a conversation, so this is really cool for me too. I look forward to getting to know you.
Yes.
And I have a whole bunch of questions about how this piece came to be. But for those of people who have joined us who have not read it, let me ask you a few questions
Sure.
about you and how you came to be the author of this piece. Maybe you could even take us back a little bit to before the pandemic. We sometimes joke and call it the pre-demic times.
BP, yeah.
BP, yes, exactly. And you are 32, and from what I understand, you had graduated from McGill and done your medical school, done some work
Internal
at
medicine.
internal
Residency.
medicine,
Yeah.
and then at Mount Sinai you were chief resident.
True.
And so you're a fairly newly minted doctor. And tell us a little bit about what your life was like and where you were in your career and what your outlook was like, say, late February, early March.
Sure. So, it certainly still felt like I was a trainee. I've been in school for, I guess, so, I completed a master's, a few days ago, a master's of education at OISE, and I'm completing a research fellowship this month. So I've essentially been in school since nursery school, straight through. So, newly minted, I think is a reasonable description. As you said, 4 years of medical school at McGill, and then essentially 5 years of residency here in Toronto, one of the years being the chief medical resident at Mount Sinai. And then for the past 2 years, I've been a clinical associate, mostly at Sunnybrook and Mount Sinai, while I complete my training, which is my master's of education and the research fellowship. So I feel like a staff physician. I certainly have the responsibilities of a staff physician, but without a permanent position and still as a trainee in many ways. I certainly defer to my colleagues, perhaps in a way that a more seasoned physician wouldn't. So it's wonderful that they are supportive and they're easy to look to as mentors. But certainly the trainees see me as the boss, so I've taken on that role. I attend on the medical teaching units on the medical wards, and I also do some solo locuming in the community.
From your article, I understand that you come from a family of doctors, and in fact, your parents have lived through and worked through the SARS. What was that? A pandemic or crisis?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you remember what that was like for them.
A little bit.
Mm-hmm.
2003 was now 17 years ago. My father's a cardiologist and my mother's an endocrinologist. And certainly what differentiated, I mean, lots of things differentiated this pandemic from that crisis, but the spread was mostly in the hospital rather than in the community as COVID is. And so certainly my father, who sees patients in the emergency room and is more front lines than my mother, who's mostly in clinic, I remember some of the stress. I remember that my mother also, they would describe in great detail the incredible PPE, personal protective equipment, which was more than for COVID. We had less of an idea with less data to go on what sort of transmission was going on. So, this is all happenstance from me as a child, essentially. But I remember them describing the enormous amount of things they would put on and take off between every room. As I sort of outlined in my piece, my dad had occasion to meet a patient who was undiagnosed and realized that this seemed like SARS, and it turned out to be. And there was a period of time during that time where he also had an exposure, was quarantined in our basement. So, what do I remember? I remember going to a Jays game and it was Toonie Tuesday, and, it was cheap because no one wanted to go outside. So certainly a different vibe in the community, that's for sure.
One of the signature qualities of this terrible plague that we're living through now is that it affects older people much more dramatically than younger people. And so being a young doctor gives you a certain status, for better or for worse, as you practice. Can you describe what it was like when you were informed? And I understand you didn't volunteer, but you were informed you were going to helm a new COVID ward.
So it's all, everything in retrospect is incredible serendipity. I was supposed to be on in May, and the circumstances made I switch to April, and then next thing I switched to March on the short stay unit, which was abolished and became the COVID ward doctor. So all of these kind of happenstances led to me happening to be scheduled for that week, 2-week period. The division director, Dr. Steve Shadowitz, who I mentioned in the article, gave me a call a week before to confirm what I had already started to realize, which was that I would be the COVID doctor. But he is an incredible person and very compassionate and understanding, and said, listen, you have a young family, and I fully understand if you would want to bow out with absolutely no prejudice if you chose to do so. And I, as I outlined in the piece, thought about it. Certainly, I knew that my parents would be very anxious, and indeed they were. But I also knew that if I said no, that someone else would be stepping up, and that person would invariably be older than me or with more comorbidities, illnesses, chronic illnesses, and therefore be higher risk. So I gave it a second's thought, but I didn't really think that I could in a good conscience say no.
I remember those early days. Physicians were getting their information from a wild variety of sources, things they were reading on social media, email groups that they were on with university colleagues. Can you describe what those early days were like, and what you knew and didn't know, and what it felt like?
So I was deferring a lot to my infectious disease colleagues, who not only are the experts in viruses, but have the latest and their fingers on the pulse in a multitude of ways. And so, when we were trying to figure out the test characteristics, say of the PCR nasal test that we use to figure out if someone has it, I was really looking to them to get a sense of how sensitive and specific the test was, how likely we were to see false negatives, which, as I outlined, or false positives rather, which I outline, false negatives, which I outline in the piece as a real issue. In trying to, there was some data, there were some articles to look at, but really it was almost, for me, it was almost word of mouth. But really, I defer to my colleagues quite a bit in lots of ways. I think as physicians, we read a lot of articles, but we're also learning from colleagues and teachers and mentors and going to rounds and things like that. So it was evolving. We were constantly in contact. I was talking to, and especially as the person who was on the ward, even though I thought of myself as a nobody, I became a point person for a lot of these discussions, which was pretty wild for me early in my training.
You wrote every surface feels radioactive. What describe emotionally what that was like?
At this point, I can't even remember what it wasn't like. And I've been on the ward since then, on a few stints now, since I came off on April 6th. I cannot touch a surface on the hospital without washing my hands. It would be anathema to me to grab my cell phone and answer a call or look at a text without washing my hands first. If I've been typing, if I've opened a door with a doorknob, I am hyper aware of my entire body. And now it's started to feel natural. I talk at the end of the piece about how a ritual can give us a sense of kind of this unconscious piece of being able to go through motions without having that conscious thought. But certainly at the beginning, there was a lot of emotion in realizing that after I touch a surface, that every, inch of my skin could be contaminated. So it was not just physically and mentally hard to keep track of everything, but like emotionally, like just, the anxiety of feeling like there are these, invisible creatures out to get us. It was a change.
You also write in the piece, this virus is a bastard. What is particular about this virus that makes it so menacing?
So, and I remember the line you're talking about, and it's as I'm kind of realizing how tricky it is. There are a few things about COVID that are particularly dismaying. So how asymptomatic it can be, how long it can be asymptomatic for. We talk about the period in which a virus can be silent in the body until it begins to manifest. And, 3 to 5 to 7 days is normal. 14 days is unconscionable. Shame on you, virus, because it makes it very difficult to isolate those people who might have been exposed, because that means that they have to be 2 weeks at least to just see if they're going to develop symptoms. And so that's one thing that makes this a unique and bastard-like virus. The fact that a patient can get better before getting worse, that's not fair, And so I describe in the piece how in the first week of the after onset of symptoms, the patient can get better. And then days 8 to 13 suddenly become this new period of danger. And so one of the patients that I describe in the piece is getting better at day 10. So I send him home. And then I can't sleep after that because I know that he's still in the period where he can decompensate, he can get worse. And so it felt not nice, it felt, and of course the another feature of it that feels very unfair is the fact that a patient can look well and feel well and still be secretly dying. It really made me doubt my clinical judgment. The point of becoming, my father once said to me that what you get through medical training is the ability to differentiate between sick and not sick. You should be able to walk into your waiting room and say, you come with me, you're next, because you realize that they're sick. And you can't do that with COVID. I go into the room to look with my magic doctor eyes and decide if they look sick. But I saw patients who felt well and looked well, and an hour later were intubated and on a ventilator in the ICU. It just felt unfair, and it feels unfair.
And did that shake your confidence?
100%. 100%. As a physician, through training, I'm developing my confidence in making diagnoses, in the fluidity of my history taking, in the skill of my physical exam maneuvers, how I'm able to kind of put things together, use the clinical data available to me to make decisions. And then suddenly those data points didn't mean what they meant before. In one moment, right, with one disease, suddenly I couldn't rely on what I had seen or what I, felt in my gut. When a patient is looking better, they should be getting better. And at the back of my, mind, I was thinking like, have I messed it up? So I think every time something, didn't go our way, like when we'd have false negative results, and then later the patient would be retested and come back positive, it just felt it felt personal. It's hard not to personify a disease that seems so mean.
Your story is very emotional, and I'm so grateful that you were willing to share not just your thoughts and your experiences, but also your feelings. I'm wondering if you gave some pause before putting your feelings out into the world. Doctors typically don't admit to crying over anxiety or compassion or a sense of helplessness or missing their family. But you did it so candidly and willingly. And I'm curious to know if you thought about that in advance.
The short answer is no. I feel strongly that we as physicians, for the good of patients and society and for the good of ourselves and our colleagues, should be more open about how we feel. I don't mind sharing with a patient when I'm worried about them. Not just because I think that they should, be aware of their own prognosis, but that I think that it brings comfort to know that as a physician, I'm not just trying to make the best decisions for my patients, but I'm also hoping that they know for sure that I care about them. During my master's, for example, I wrote a lot about the fact that that I think that we need to change the way that we teach empathy and things like that. I've done quite a bit of creative writing, so it's not my first foray into opening my heart and showing it. So I was surprised to hear how many people were shocked that I was willing to say those things. And I guess I was pleased. I think that every person every one of my colleagues, because I've had quite a few people reach out, not just from the general public, but of my colleagues. And if they're reaching out and saying that they're pleased that I shared those feelings, then I am heartened to hear that that we may be able to move the needle in what physicians are willing to share with other people. Because I think it can only be a good thing for our own mental health, for our colleagues, for our patients, for the public. So
the reaction has been positive?
I would say so, yes. To an understatement. No, it's been overwhelming. Yeah.
Describe that a little bit.
The first 4 evenings after the piece came out, replying to emails and messages was a full-time job, but it was really nice. It's obviously very easy to feel isolated and lonely, and to have so many people coming out to send a nice message and to tell me how they felt, how they connected to it, or how they were brought some peace by it, was really wonderful and nice. I thought if I'm gonna show that I can be an empathetic physician, I better reply to everyone.
So you mentioned your master's work is on empathy. What were you studying exactly?
So it was a general master's of education, but I had a lot of flexibility in what I could study and write about. So one piece I recently published, that was a piece that started as a term paper in philosophy of education, was called "Can Doctors Be Taught Virtue?"
And what's the answer?
Yes, but, right? I think that it doesn't, it's not something that's easily didactically taught. It has to do with, seeing mentors and supervisors act in a certain way. It has to do with the culture of medicine and how comfortable we are in doing exactly that and sharing our feelings. And it has to do with in the article, I talk about an example of a colleague of ours who started a program at her medical school where the idea is to make medical students feel cared for in order to allow them to care for others. It's Nell Nodding's ethic of care, that one cannot care for others unless they feel cared for themselves. And I think that there's truth in that.
Did you take things you learned from that research as you were working in Sunnybrook doing COVID?
I think so. And I think that there's lots of colleagues who know those things without having studied it. So Dr. Shadowitz, who I mentioned before, is division director. He was on for the few days before me on the COVID ward. And one of the earliest quotes in the piece is a quote from him. And he had identified that we don't have any treatments for COVID, and we still don't, outside of clinical trials. And so if all you have is oxygen and monitoring and friendly eyes above a mask, then you'd better show compassion, because it's all we have to give to our patients. It's almost 19th century medicine, where we go and we sit by the bedside. We don't sit, we have to stand. And we give our patients the true impression. We show them that we're in it with them. I think that's really important, and that's something that I describe with the dentist, is the idea that of doctor as witness, that we can be seeing and validating the patient's suffering, and that we can be in it with them, that we revel in their successes, and that we suffer with them in their suffering, not the same way. But when I say to the dentist, we're in this together, we're going to get to the day 13, day 14 together. That's what I mean, And when I found out that he needed to be intubated, I was devastated by that. And I think that, there's a lot of folks who say, well, you can't do that without suffering too much of your own mental health. But I think that there is a balance that can be drawn. And that's the kind of doctor I want to be.
You mentioned that you've done a lot of writing. So I, of course, am curious to know how someone who spent so much time in school, in doctor school, has the ability to write as well as you do. What do you read? Who are you? Who's your inspiration? What made you think, oh, I see I'm living through history and I have a front row seat. I should write about this. What was that process like?
So a bit of background, I started in the humanities before going into medicine. So my undergrad degree was in philosophy and math and computer science. So writing was my first interest. And so moving into medicine, both from my own passions, but from a functional perspective, I wanted to kind of know how I could, marry the two arts and sciences within medicine and the humanities within medicine. And so that probably helped. But also, I'm not a good writer. What I mean by that is I'm not the kind of writer who has the discipline to sit down for a half an hour every week and make sure that I write something. It's about, every year or a couple times a year, I'll just experience something where it just tears its way right through my chest, and I have to sit down and write it. And those pieces that I've published up till now only in medical journals, with a couple of exceptions, are pieces where I felt too strongly not to put something on paper. And so, a lot of people said, thank you for sharing this, or thank you for documenting this. I think this goes back to the other question. Neither of those were the reason that I wrote it. I had to write it. I was keeping notes when I was just struck by something. I was, one line that came out of just me thinking in my mind was, every day brings new horrors. That was just something that I thought to myself because I was experiencing it. And I think that thinking of one's life in a narrative form can actually be therapeutic to living it. If you think of yourself as suffering within a narrative rather than within an interminable lifetime, I think that can be peaceful. And certainly near the end of the 2 weeks, I found myself thinking like, gosh, this is hard, but it's going to make a great story.
Well, I
So
think it does draw from like the principles of meditation, which is
yeah,
almost like to watch yourself and to watch the thing, to sort of observe it rather than be jerked around by it. And then you can,
yes,
narrative certainly provides an opportunity for that.
yes,
So everyone, the thing about this crisis, and I certainly experience this in the world of journalism, is that it changes every week or two. What we're writing about one week is different from what we're writing about the next week, because
yeah.
the conditions on the ground change so fast. So I'm sure everyone on this call and all of our readers want to know what Sunnybrook is like right now. What is, your piece came to sort of an end in April. Here we are towards the end of May. What do the hospitals look like, and what does your hospital look like?
So what you may have gotten the sense of in the piece was that it had this moment where things were rising. They called in a second COVID doctor. They called in a third COVID doctor. But by the end of the 2 weeks, we had sent the third COVID doctor home, and we were back down to 2. And I'll say that going back to the narrative question before, when I started thinking of my 2 weeks as a narrative, it's the 14 days of COVID. If you can get to day 14, you're probably in the clear. I started thinking of my 2 weeks on the ward like that. And I started to say, well, hey, maybe I'll actually be in the clear. So we thought maybe we were in the clear. And the numbers started tapering off. They started being stable. Curiously, the medicine numbers were at the lowest they've ever been.
What does that mean, medicine numbers?
So those are the patients who we usually care for on the medicine wards that don't have COVID. So that's things like heart failure, kidney failure, pneumonia, meningitis, lung disease, all the rest. We were seeing much, much less than usual, and we couldn't understand why. And again, another quote from Steve Shadowitz was, we didn't know that COVID cured heart disease and stroke, and yet here we are. But of course, he was being glib, and it doesn't. And so in the past few weeks, we've started seeing quite a steep rise in those numbers of patients. And they're probably patients who neglected, not by their own fault, to come in because they couldn't or felt that they couldn't or shouldn't come to hospital. I think probably the threshold to come to hospital is much higher. And it makes me think, when all is said and done and we try to calculate the impact on society of COVID, if we look just at the numbers of folks who have died from the virus itself, we will miss an enormous amount of the numbers of patients who have died waiting for their cancer surgeries and heart surgeries and all the rest, who aren't captured by that. So we've seen a rising number of medicine patients. In the past week, we've also seen a bit of a rise in the number of COVID patients. People are talking about the Mother's Day rise, and certainly this past weekend, we're seeing the fatigue of following social distancing guidelines. So, one other line that I can't stop thinking about from my piece is, it's like a marathon underwater. It's really hard to keep going. It's very easy to just say, well, and I think that we as a society can't afford to do that. Certainly, if we want to get out the other side and be able to hang out with our friends in a park, then we have to keep going, because every time we do that too early, it's going to set us back. And we're already seeing that from the Ministry of Health guidelines. So,
I realize you're not a public health official,
yes.
but there's been a lot of talk in the newspapers the last few days about Ontario performing not so well. And I'm wondering what your assessment is of that, and what your point of view is.
So I will say that my point of view is probably not worth very much. I have been working on the wards so much that I feel so micro-focused on my 10, 15, 20 patients that when my friends send me an article, they're like, what do you think of this, Ariel? And honestly, they know more than I do if they read the news more than me. But certainly with large populations and large city centers, and the tragedies that are happening in our long-term care facilities, it doesn't surprise me too much that Ontario is not the best in the game.
Let me ask you a question that is a little more focused on your particular experience. How do you think the doctors and nurses and cleaning staff and everyone you work with will be affected by all of this in the long term? Based on what you know from your parents' experience with SARS and what the literature tells you and what you feel and sense from your day-to-day, how traumatized will the medical professional world be, and all the associated employees of the hospital?
When I think of my colleagues, I think, you know, I'm just filled with so much gratitude and love at this point. I can't even tell you. The interactions with other people, not just because there are other people in general, which we're all starved for, but that's the highlight of my day. You know, I've never felt so much gratitude towards them being at the hospital, doing what they're doing. And certainly this story could be any of their stories. The nurses are far more on the front lines than I was. They see the patients more. They're more, you know, the ER doctors and the paramedics are probably far more traumatized than I only have gratitude for them. And the other thing that I think about when I think of my colleagues on the ward is that and I'm really pleased that we've been really supportive towards one another, and we've been getting through this by looking out for one another. And on all of the COVID wards, there's somebody who's assigned to be this safety officer, and they go around and they make sure that everyone is you know, putting on and taking off their protective equipment properly. And it doesn't feel like they're trying to get us in trouble. It feels like we're supporting one another. So I think that the camaraderie on the ward, even though we're all distanced and we're all wearing masks, has been moving rather than disheartening. But in the long term, it's hard for me to, you know, the future has never been so inscrutable.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. But certainly I don't think I'm ever going to treat any person interaction or surface interaction glibly again. You know, I don't see myself going back to a time where I would open a door and then eat a sandwich. I just can't imagine. You know, I think, and I hope that we value human interactions more. I hope that we value human life more. One thing that COVID does, aside from make people sick, is bring every vulnerability that we have, every shortcoming in society that we have, and bring it, you know, to full light, as we see all of the societal inequities suddenly become front and center. You know, you're living month to month on a paycheck, and if you don't work a month, it's going to destroy your livelihood. Well, we see that in COVID, and we see how it you know, COVID affects those with low socioeconomic status inordinately. We see the racial inequities and how people of color are dying in higher numbers. You know, it's interesting how much COVID is a social disease just as much or more than it's a medical disease. And we saw that, how it spread across the globe. We saw that in action as well. So I hope that when it's all over, that we don't forget those lessons, and that we don't go back to normal, that we work towards something better. I think that would be a real commendable thing that we could do from this awful crisis.
I think that's a really beautiful way for us to end, because it's hopeful. And I share your sentiment entirely. I'm so grateful to you for writing the piece and for trusting our readership with it and trusting the magazine with it. Thank you for your time tonight. I know that time is the most precious resource. You have a young son, and he probably wants your attention. So I'm going to let you go and thank you. I wanted to let everyone on the call know that we'll be having conversations like this weekly or regularly. In any case, our next one is on June 3rd with Jennifer Keesmaat. We're going to be talking about how COVID has changed the city and all those problems you mentioned that COVID has exposed. That's true on an urban and municipal front as well. So I'll be asking her about the lessons we've learned and how we can be a better city at the end of this. Thanks so much for your time, and it was lovely meeting you.
Lovely to meet you
Zoom.
too.
Have a good night.
Same to you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.